Into the bridge at Douve. The detonation cord lay coiled in the Norman mud like a dead snake, its waterproof casing split open from the hard landing. Staff Sergeant Jake McNasty McNiece crouched beside it in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins after the botched jump into occupied France. The filthy 13 were supposed to drop clean behind enemy lines near the flooded Normandy causeways, rig the stone bridge spanning the Douve River, and withdraw before German armour could cross at first light in June 1944. Instead, they were scattered across 3 miles of Norman hedgerows like broken toys. The bridge loomed 30 yards ahead through the morning fog, its medieval arches still intact, despite 2 years of occupation. German sentries patrolled both ends, their cigarette embers glowing like fireflies in the mist. McNiece examined the frayed cord again, calculating. He had maybe 20 feet of usable length, enough to connect 2 satchel charges, but not enough to reach the safe detonation distance his training manual recommended. Someone would have to stay close. Too close. 3 hours earlier, McNiece had watched his sticks scatter like leaves across the Norman countryside. The pilot, rattled by flak over the Normandy drop zones, had released them 2 miles south of their intended target, near the flooded fields. Private Rodriguez landed hard in a drainage ditch and twisted his ankle. Corporal Hayes got tangled in a hedgerow and spent 20 minutes cutting himself free, while German patrols swept the area with flashlights and harsh voices. McNiece himself came down in a farmyard, startling a milk cow that bellowed loud enough to wake half the Wehrmacht. Now he studied the bridge's stone foundation through his field glasses, looking for the sweet spot where a properly placed charge could bring down the whole structure. The filthy 13 earned their reputation for getting impossible jobs done in the chaos following D-Day. But this felt different. The damaged cord wasn't just equipment failure. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong since they left England. Hayes crawled up beside him, mud caked in his hair. "Cord's shot to hell, Sarge. We could try the backup fuses, but they're slow burn. Germans'll see us coming a mile away." McNiece nodded, still staring at the frayed copper wire gleaming through the torn casing. In the distance, he could hear Rodriguez limping through the underbrush, trying to keep up despite his injury. These men followed him into the Norman hedgerows because they trusted his instincts, his ability to improvise when everything else failed. Now that trust felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. "What about the primer cord from my pack?" Rodriguez whispered, dragging his bad leg through the wet grass. "Might be enough to daisy-chain the charges." McNiece shook his head, watching a German sentry light another cigarette on the bridge. "That stuff burns too fast. Won't give us time to get clear." He paused, calculating blast patterns in his head. "Unless someone stays behind to make sure it goes off right." The silence stretched between them like the detonation cord coiled in the mud. They all knew what he was suggesting, and they all knew the math. The bridge had to come down. Those panzer engines rumbling in the distance were maybe an hour away from the Normandy causeways, and if German armour crossed the Douve River, the entire beachhead operation could collapse. Thousands of American boys were pinned down in the hedgerows, counting on the filthy 13 to buy them time. From his position in a shell crater 20 yards back, Lieutenant Morrison studied the situation through his own field glasses. The young officer had inherited the filthy 13 3 weeks ago when their previous commander was evacuated with shrapnel wounds. Morrison understood demolitions from the textbooks, but watching McNiece work was like observing some dangerous form of jazz, improvised, effective, and completely outside regulation. "Sergeant McNiece," Morrison called softly. "What's your assessment?" McNiece didn't look back. "Assessment is, we're screwed 6 ways from Sunday, Lieutenant. Wrong drop zone, half our gear damaged, and those krauts aren't going to stand around smoking while we rig charges at a safe distance. So, what do you recommend?" I recommend somebody back at headquarters learns to read a map. But right now, we work with what we've got. Hayes spat in the mud, that stubborn look crossing his face that meant he was prepared to knock McNiece unconscious rather than let him face this alone. You're not doing this by yourself, McNasty. Like hell I'm not. McNiece's voice carried the edge that made him famous for insubordination throughout the 506th PIR. This isn't a democracy, Corporal. It's a demolition job. But even as he said it, McNiece knew they wouldn't listen. The filthy 13 never followed orders they didn't believe in, and they sure as hell wouldn't start now in the Norman bocage. Rodriguez was already checking his rifle, despite the twisted ankle. Hayes had begun sorting through their remaining explosives with the methodical care of a man planning something dangerous. A church bell chimed in the distance. 5 o'clock. German voices echoed across the bridge as the sentries changed shifts. McNiece watched them through the fog, counting their movements, timing their patrol routes. The damaged cord coiled around his wrist like a promise, a reminder that sometimes the only way forward led through chaos. In the growing light, he could see the bridge's weak points more clearly. The third pier from the north bank, where centuries of flooding had worn the mortar thin. One charge placed right, timed right, could drop the whole span into the Douve River. The question was whether any of them would live to see it fall. Lieutenant Morrison crawled forward to join them in the muddy observation post, his uniform already showing the stains that marked him as no longer completely green. 3 weeks with the filthy 13 had taught him that the gap between what looked possible on paper and what actually worked in the Norman hedgerows could swallow entire operations. "Sergeant, I just got word from battalion. The 502nd failed to take their bridge at Chef Dupont. German armor is already moving through that sector." McNiece felt something cold settle in his stomach. If the Krauts had armor moving freely through the Normandy countryside, this bridge became more than just another target. It became the cork in the bottle. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Radio traffic suggests German reconnaissance reached the east bank 20 minutes ago. Main columns may be 45 minutes behind them." Hayes looked up from the TNT satchel he'd been examining. "Sarge, this charge took some water during the drop. Might not blow clean." McNiece moved to examine the explosive. The canvas wrapping was soaked through, and he could see moisture around the blasting cap housing. In the dry runs back in England, they'd been warned about water-damaged charges, unpredictable timing, reduced blast effect, sometimes complete failure. "We'll have to use both satchels, double the charges at the pier." McNiece was thinking aloud now, working through the math of destruction. But that means even less cord to work with. Rodriguez shifted his weight, favoring his good ankle. "What about civilians? Saw families moving south through the hedgerows an hour ago. Kids, old people, pulling carts." It was a good question. The bridge wasn't just a military target. It was how people crossed the Douve River, how farmers moved their livestock, how families escaped the fighting in the northern parishes of Normandy. Blow it too early, and they'd trap French civilians on the wrong side of German armor. Wait too long, and those same civilians would be caught in a tank battle. Morrison studied his map, squinting in the poor light. Battalion says civilian evacuation was supposed to be complete by 0400. "And you believe that?" McNiece's voice carried decades of Oklahoma skepticism compressed into 4 words. The young officer was quiet for a moment. "No, Sergeant, I don't." In the distance, they could hear the grinding of heavy engines growing louder. German voices carried across the water, and McNiece caught fragments. Something about schedules, about American paratroopers, about the need to secure the crossing before full daylight exposed them to Allied air support. The detonation cord lay in the mud like an accusation, 20 feet of wire to do a 40-foot job. McNiece had blown culverts and railway bridges from the bocage to the Rhine, but always with proper equipment, sufficient cord, time to calculate and retreat. This felt different. This felt like improvisation at its most dangerous edge. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. McNiece made his choice the way he always did, by trusting his hands more than his head. He picked up the damaged detonation cord and began splicing it with wire from Hayes's field telephone, his fingers working by feel in the pre-dawn gloom. The Normandy fog was lifting, and soon they'd be visible to any German sentry who looked their way. "All right, listen up," he whispered. "We're going to rig those charges, and we're all going to make it out. But first, we need to get a lot closer to those Krauts than any of us want to." Hayes grinned in the darkness. "Wouldn't be the filthy 13 if it was easy, Sarge." Rodriguez chambered around, despite his twisted ankle. "Just tell us where to plant the TNT." The plan took shape with the deadly simplicity that marked McNiece's best work. Hayes would circle north and create a distraction, nothing fancy, just enough noise to draw the sentries to one end of the bridge. Rodriguez would provide overwatch from the hedgerow, ready to cover their withdrawal despite his injury. McNiece would sprint the 30 yards to the third pier, rig both satchel charges with the spliced detonation cord, and pray the water-damaged TNT would blow when he needed it to. Lieutenant Morrison would coordinate from their current position, ready to call in artillery support if the demolition failed and German armor reached the bridge intact. "Sergeant," Morrison said quietly, "for what it's worth, I'm recommending you for Bronze Star after this action." McNiece looked at him with something between amusement and disgust. "Lieutenant, you can recommend me for court-martial if we pull this off. Right now, let's just focus on making sure those panzers take a swim in the Douve River." The attack began at 0530 hours, just as the first German reconnaissance vehicles appeared on the eastern approach to the bridge. Hayes's distraction worked perfectly, a few rifle shots from the north bank that sent 3 German sentries running toward what they thought was a sniper position. In the confusion, McNiece sprinted across open ground that seemed to stretch for miles under his boots. The bridge pier felt solid under his hands as he worked, cold stone that had withstood centuries of flooding and war. The TNT satchels went into position against the weakest point in the foundation, exactly where hydraulic pressure and age had done most of his work for him. The spliced detonation cord snaked back through the grass like a lifeline, 20 feet of wire and prayer leading to the small electrical detonator that would send destruction rippling through stone and steel. German voices were shouting now, and McNiece could hear boots running on the bridge deck above him. Hayes's diversion had bought them minutes, but the sentries were getting organized, calling for reinforcements, setting up fields of fire that would turn his withdrawal route into a killing ground. The first panzer tank appeared through the morning mist as McNiece finished arming the charges. Time slowed to the rhythm of his heartbeat as he connected the final wire. McNiece's hands shook as he twisted the last wire connection, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd never told anyone about that morning in Normandy. The official after-action report would say Staff Sergeant McNiece successfully demolished the bridge at Douve River, denying enemy armor access to Allied positions. It wouldn't mention how the 1st Panzer commander had stopped his tank short of the bridge and was studying the western bank through field glasses, obviously suspicious of the too quiet morning. It wouldn't mention the French family. They came out of the morning mist like ghosts, an old man pulling a cart loaded with household belongings, a young woman carrying a baby, 2 children who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. They were heading straight for the bridge, probably following the same route they'd used to cross the Douve River their entire lives, unaware that American paratroopers and German armor were about to turn their escape route into rubble and smoke. McNiece froze with the detonator in his hands, 20 feet of spliced wire connecting him to enough TNT to kill everyone on that bridge. The Panzer was still hesitating on the eastern bank, but he could hear more engines in the distance. The entire German column would be here within minutes, and if he didn't blow the bridge now, those tanks would roll straight into the scattered positions of the 506th PIR. But if he triggered the charges now, the French family would die. Hayes was shouting something from his position, probably wondering why the bridge was still standing. Rodriguez had him covered from the hedgerow, but German infantry were already moving to flank their positions. Lieutenant Morrison was waiting for the explosion that would either save their sector or force him to call down artillery on his own men. The old Frenchman looked directly at McNiece across 30 yards of open ground. Their eyes met for maybe 3 seconds, and in that moment, McNiece saw something he'd carry for the rest of his life. Not fear, but understanding. The old man turned and began pushing his family back toward the eastern bank, moving with desperate speed toward the German lines rather than safety, because he'd seen an American soldier with a detonator and understood that staying meant dying. McNiece waited until they disappeared into the mist before he squeezed the trigger. The TNT erupted with a sound like the earth splitting open, sending the third pier of the ancient bridge tumbling into the Douve River in pieces. Stone and steel that had lasted centuries dissolved into spray and debris, taking with it the German armor's best route into the American sector. The panzer commander never had a chance to react. One moment he was studying a suspicious bridge approach. The next he was staring at rushing water where his crossing used to be. But McNiece never forgot the old man's face, or the choice that family made to trust an American demolition sergeant they'd never met. The Bronze Star citation would call it a textbook demolition executed under enemy fire. McNiece knew it was 3 seconds of eye contact that taught him the difference between completing a mission and living with the consequences. 43 years later, McNiece sat in a diner outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, watching freight trains cross the Arkansas River Bridge through the window. The rumble of steel wheels on steel rails always brought him back to that June morning in Normandy when ancient stone fell into the Douve River and changed the course of a war. The newspaper reporter across from him was young, earnest, working on a story about D-Day veterans for the anniversary. She'd done her homework, knew about the Filthy 13, had read the after-action reports and citation summaries. The records show you destroyed the bridge at 5:32 hours, exactly on schedule, she said, consulting her notes. German armor was delayed long enough for the beachhead to stabilize. Clean, professional demolition work. McNiece sipped his coffee and watched another train cross the river. Reports don't tell you much about what it felt like. What did it feel like? He was quiet for a long time, thinking about Hayes and Rodriguez, about Lieutenant Morrison, who'd gone on to command a battalion and die at the Bulge 6 months later, about the French family whose names he'd never learned, who'd trusted a muddy American paratrooper enough to turn around and walk toward German guns, rather than risk the bridge when it blew. Heavy, he finally said. It felt heavy. The reporter waited for more, but McNiece was done talking about the technical details. How could he explain that the detonation cord had worked perfectly, that the water-damaged TNT had blown exactly when it was supposed to, that every element of the demolition had gone according to his improvised plan? How could he describe the weight of choices made in 3 seconds, or the way certain faces lingered in memory long after the medals were put away? Hayes had died at Eindhoven 2 months later. Rodriguez made it home to New Mexico and raised 5 children. Lieutenant Morrison got his Bronze Star posthumously, along with a Silver Star for actions in Belgium that McNiece never heard the details of. The bridge at Douve River had been rebuilt by 1947, stronger than before, carrying French farmers and their families across water that no longer ran quite the same way. McNiece had never gone back to see it. "Is there anything else you'd want people to know about that day?" the reporter asked. McNiece finished his coffee and stood up, watching the last freight car disappear across the Arkansas River Bridge. The weight of the detonation cord seemed to settle around his wrists again. 20 feet of wire and copper that had connected him to a choice he'd never completely understood. "Just that the real story isn't in the reports," he said. "The real story is what we carried afterward, and some things you carry alone." The reporter closed her notebook, probably sensing that she'd gotten as close to the truth as McNiece was willing to let anyone come. After she left, he sat back down and ordered another cup of coffee, watching trains cross the river and thinking about bridges. The ones you blow and the ones you build, the ones that carry you forward and the ones that bring you back. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.